But the wonderful thing about it is when we address one of them, we start to address the others without actually having to focus on them. So if we start to zero in on the gut health and the microflora, that really helps us with the picky eating behavior and the nutrient deficiencies. Because as we start to balance the gut flora,
Welcome to the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, where we believe that raising healthy kids shouldn't be complicated. Our mission is to inspire 20 million families worldwide to take the steps to raise the healthiest generation in our history. We'll interview some of the world's leading experts in nutrition, human potential, and children's health, as well as extraordinary chefs and foodies to gain insight into simple, fun, and creative ways to introduce natural health into homes across this planet. Some exciting news to share with everyone. I have teamed up with one of the most dynamic people in the ADHD, autism, chronic illness, natural healing world. Her name is Jen Kozek, and she's the author of Healing Without Hurting and the kids' book, A Healthy New Me and ADHD Free. And we've teamed up to create a special group experience for parents of kids who are struggling with any of these conditions, who are looking to help their kids function better and heal naturally, drug-free. The two of us work a lot individually with parents and on social media and online and podcasts and so forth, and we get lots of questions from parents, and often the same questions come up over and over again, which are, there's so much information out there. How do I know what direction to go? You know, I read this book and it told me to eat these things and feed my kid these things. And I read this other book that told me something else. And I read this book that said to get these tests. And I read this book that said those tests are useless and do these things instead. So we decided that what would be a valuable service would be to team up together, bring our own strengths, mine from the natural health, nutrition, neurology world, hers from, she's a practicing psychotherapist, and the mom of two kids who she's helped heal from these types of conditions naturally. So we have a lot of awesome background to bring to the table to really support parents like you. And our goal is to be able to lead you through step by step and be able to give you feedback along your journey. So the format is primarily a closed Facebook group, and it has a totally affordable monthly fee because we wanted to make it accessible and affordable for many people to be involved so we could get out there and make a difference, because both of us have the mission of impacting a huge number of parents and kids in this world and make the next generation the best generation. I am going to put the link in the show notes. So if you're not listening on the kidseatingbroccoli.com website or kidseatingbroccoli.podcast.com website, go there, find the show notes for this episode, and you'll find the link to find out more about the group, to sign up. I highly encourage you, and thank you for listening. And for our next guest, we have Deborah Morgan from Kids Health Revolution and some of the other great work she does. And so I'd love for you, Deborah, just to tell us a little bit about you, how you got to be doing what you're doing and what you're up to these days.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me, Dr. Brad. I'm so happy to be here. I'm part of this wonderful summit that you're doing. My background is in counseling, and then recently, since my journey with my son, I've gotten back into school and gotten certified as a holistic nutrition consultant and some specialization in gut healing protocols, the GAPS protocol specifically. So I work with parents who have kids with chronic illness of all kinds, so ADHD, autism, asthma, autoimmune, all of these things, and I help them find natural solutions, including diet, as a way to improve their kids' health. And this is all really based on my own personal journey with my son, and I'm not sure if you want me to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that, sure.
Sure. So I know that one of the things that any parent who has had a child diagnosed with a health condition of any kind feels is this sense of real frustration and sort of powerlessness, because we're so often told that there's nothing that we can do. And I mean, that was my experience. when my son was 2 years old, I sort of nonchalantly wandered into the doctor's office to have something that I thought was completely innocuous, totally innocent, checked out. And it was like a nuclear bomb detonated on my life in that moment. It just shook me to the core, because I was not prepared to hear that he had an autoimmune condition. We were told that it would likely spread, get worse, and that there was no really great treatment options for this kind of condition. Nothing that we could do about it. We were just going to have to learn to live with it. And you can imagine, right, that you'd feel pretty powerless in that situation. And I know a lot of parents have been there. But for me, there was this little voice always in the back of my head that just was like, this just isn't right. It doesn't feel right to me that there is nothing that we can do for this little tiny body to help bring balance back. And that sort of began my journey into this world of functional medicine, of functional nutrition, and really gave me the experience of witnessing what's possible for our bodies when we just give it, the support and the raw materials it needs to find that balance. So, fast forward, he's 9 years old now. He's a happy, healthy little boy. His autoimmune condition continues to improve. It has never spread, never gotten worse. We've never had to use any of the hormones or steroids or anything else that was suggested. It's all been done with gut healing, lifestyle, environment changes, easy, non-invasive, no side effect stuff. So yeah, that's why I'm in this work, is to tell other parents, you know what, you have more power than you can imagine just by using food as medicine.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message. One, just to hear, certainly, so you feel like you can do something, because as parents, of course, we want to help our kids, and it can be very very frustrating to feel like we can't do anything. And two, I think that often, or at least sometimes, when we learn about some of these lifestyle or nutrition or these type of things, we can, as parents, we can sometimes feel guilty, like, oh my gosh, I did this to my kid or something like that. And so I appreciate that, the way you're sharing it is from sort of the empowerment perspective rather than like, you messed your kid up. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember I went through that. I went through a lot of the self-blame issues and what did I do and what did I eat when I was pregnant? And oh my God, I didn't take my prenatal vitamin for a couple of months. Was that it? Is that why? So, there's lots of little pieces of the puzzle that go into creating health problems, and we're going to talk about them more. But the really good news here is that we have the power to do something about it now when it manifests itself.
Right. Yeah. And that's the important piece right there, because if you go through that, which, is natural as a parent, like, what did I do? And then to feel like there's nothing you can do about it now, I mean, that's totally disempowering.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm excited to jump into having you share some of your specific expertise. You mentioned about inflammation. I want to talk about gut health and so forth. So why don't you just, jump in and tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, absolutely. So I guess the first place that I would start is there's probably parents who are going to watch who, we're talking about ADHD here, and this woman's talking about her kid having an autoimmune condition. Like, what's up with that? So, I want to mention quickly that though they might seem very different, when we look at it from the functional perspective, they're very similar. And so it comes down to the genetics and the epigenetics. And we know that there's underlying causes that contribute to all chronic illnesses, no matter what it is, whether it's autoimmune or asthma or eczema or ADHD or autism. How it manifests in your child is just showing up wherever their sort of weakest link is. For my son, it was his immune system. For other kids, it's the brain. For some, it's the lungs. So absolutely all of these things are related. And if you can conquer something like an autoimmune condition, you can absolutely conquer something like ADHD and things that are going on in the brain. So what those things have in common, the underlying factor is inflammation. So there's some really interesting studies coming out. There's a fellow, I think his name is Eric Hollander, Dr. Eric Hollander. He's a psychiatrist and a researcher in autism, and he works out of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. So he must be a pretty smart guy. And he has come out as saying that psychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders are very much related to systemic illness and inflammation. So that's actually really exciting stuff for me. That gets me really excited because we as parents have a lot of power to help our kids decrease inflammation in their body. So if inflammation is this underlying cause, then as parents, this is where we can go in with some tools and start dealing with that inflammation. And so, let's talk about, just for a quick couple of seconds, some details onto, why inflammation affects the brain. Like, there's inflammation, we need inflammation, it's a good thing. But when it's chronic, what we have is a disruption in cellular communication. So if you think about it, it's really important in our brains, in our child's brain, that the cells be able to communicate clearly with each other. And when we have this condition of chronic ongoing inflammation, it interferes with those cells and their ability to communicate with each other. And so then we see symptoms like ADHD and autism and other psychiatric disorders. There's some studies that are showing that it may even affect how brain cells are developed, how they're born. And the other thing is that some of the mediators for inflammation can actually be toxic to the brain cells, to the neurons themselves. So that's just, just a little slice of information as to why you should care about inflammation and how it affects your child's brain.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So then if this is sort of all new or an area where a parent maybe isn't that familiar, I could imagine thinking, that all makes sense what you're saying, but my kid, how do I know my kid's inflamed, or why would they be inflamed? They're not walking around in pain all the time, or, that type of thing. So
exactly. Yes. Wonderful question. So, I use a bit of a visual for this because the world that we live in is sort of outpacing our body's ability to cope. And so this is part of the reason that we see chronic inflammation in our children, and we might not notice it any other way except for the fact that they're manifesting a chronic health condition like ADHD. So there's several things. So let's imagine, so if you will, picture a campfire, a nice roaring bonfire, because inflammation is often referred to as like a fire in the body. So there's this fire burning in the body. Now we have all kinds of big logs around the fire. And those logs, we can either feed the fire and make it grow, or we could pull those logs off and keep them out of the fire so we can start to sort of dampen that inflammatory response in the body. So a couple of those things that are contributing that we as parents have control over are things like nutrient deficiencies, and feeding into that is picky eating behavior, because oftentimes kids with ADHD do have some picky eating issues. So if there's picky eating, there's likely nutrient deficiencies. So those two are big. Blood sugar imbalances are an issue. The unbalanced blood sugar spikes and drops and all of these things are really fueling those fires of inflammation. So if you have a child who's a picky eater, maybe they're tending to eat more of the carbohydrate-rich foods or the really sugary foods, and this is going to be causing a lot of these spikes and dips and blood sugar imbalance, which is contributing to the inflammation. And then, of course, we have environmental insults. So maybe they're drinking out of a lot of plastic cups and they're taking their lunch to school in plastic baggies, and they're exposed to a lot of different toxins and pesticides in their foods and chemicals in the home and all of these things. That's also feeding the inflammation. And then we also have, of course, the gut, and that's my personal favorite, is the gut and the flora, so the little bugs that live inside the gut. And so if that's not healthy, there's imbalances there, that will also be feeding the fires of inflammation. And if there's imbalance in those flora, the flora can be actually contributing to the picky eating behavior. It can be driving the cravings for the sugary and carbohydrate foods that your kid exclusively wants to eat, that's causing the blood sugar imbalances and feeding the inflammation, and it just becomes this sort of vicious cycle. right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And picky eating, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is certainly something, in the world of, parents with kids with ADHD and autism and the different symptoms like that, that we hear a lot about. My kid is a picky eater, because,
Yes.
It's getting more well known that dietary factors can play a part, whether it causes it or at least improves it, that
Right.
diet change might be valuable. But it seems daunting to a lot of parents because they have this challenge with the picky eating, and so it's like, oh, my kid will only eat these 5 things and they're not supposed to eat any of those 5 things. So, what do I do?
They're going to starve to death. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the beauty about thinking about all of these things that are contributing to the inflammation is, yes, it can be overwhelming when you think, oh my Lord, like that's a lot of stuff that I got to start pulling out of the fire. But the wonderful thing about it is when we address one of them, we start to address the others without actually having to focus on them. So if we start to zero in on the gut health and the microflora, that really helps us with the picky eating behavior and the nutrient deficiencies. Because as we start to balance the gut flora, it's actually shocking to see what kids will accept on their plate once we start to bring some balance back to that gut flora. And I've worked with kids with autism that are some of the really most selective eaters you can imagine. There's lots of sensory issues going on there. And, we go through some stringent protocols, but once we get some balance back there, the parents are amazed at what their child, who would previously only eat, muffins and toaster strudel, will start to accept, because those gut flora, they've changed and they're driving cravings for the foods that feed them, rather than the sort of bad guys that are driving cravings that will feed and help them flourish. So as we start to pull one log off the fire and address it, it starts to address all of the other issues there as well.
Yeah, that definitely makes some good sense. So why don't you talk to us about where, some specific strategies, or where someone might start if they are like, oh, you know what? This all sounds like my kid, and I know I want to make some change. So where do we start? What are some things you start with people?
Okay, so the first thing that I suggest that people start with is the foundational layer. So I have what I call another visual. So I call it the parent power pyramid. Haven't trademarked it yet, but I just might. So at the very base of this pyramid is environment, lifestyle, and gut health. Because if you think about that pyramid shape, you have to have a strong foundation, right, in order for a pyramid to stand. So our power as parents comes in on that base level. And then as you work up, maybe you start with doing some detoxification later, and you move into infections and parasites and maybe genetics and all of these other things. You need to have that really strong foundation at the bottom. And this is where our power really comes in as parents. And this is where, for a lot of kids, that's all that needs to happen, is the changes in their environment, their lifestyle, and their diet. And some simple little tweaks are all it takes for them to be able to start to live and flourish as fully as they possibly can. So quick little things before I even get into the diet side of it is I highly recommend that all parents take a couple of quick approaches to cleaning up their environment in their home. So just once a week, have a look around at something that you're using in your home and see if you can find a natural alternative to it. So instead of chemical cleaners for your kitchen, start using vinegar and water. And switch out your shampoo and your body care products for something that's a little bit more natural. And just, 3 or 4 of those little changes takes a huge burden off the body in terms of the toxic burden that it's dealing with. And usually I find that most parents, once they kind of start the ball rolling with a few of those things, then it becomes a little easier to dive into the dietary side of things. So let's go into those then, shall we?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the first thing that I usually recommend that parents do is attack breakfast. So if we can go after breakfast and make that a meal where your child is getting lots of healthy fats, they're getting protein, and they're getting good natural sweeteners and fiber into their body first thing in the morning, that's really setting them up for that really good, steady blood sugar. Because when you think about what most of our kids are eating for breakfast in the morning, especially if they're picky eaters, we're setting them up for those blood sugar spikes right away, right throughout the day. And a lot of those foods are damaging to the gut bugs as well. So when our kids are exclusively eating foods that are processed, refined, carbohydrate driven, sweetened foods, we are favoring the more pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria, and we are allowing those ones to crowd out the good guys because we're not giving them enough of the foods that they need, which is the fibers and certain types of fats that they feed off of. So the reason that that's important is because some of these pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria can actually send signals to the brain to increase inflammation in the body. We also know now that these gut bugs are involved with the production of neurotransmitters, which are going to affect how your child's brain functions, right? Whether they're not producing enough or they're producing too much or they're not being broken down properly, we know that that is very much affected by the balance of the bugs that are in the gut. So breakfast is a great place to start. So I know that it can be really overwhelming to parents. So I say, start with breakfast and say, I'm going to start every day finding some breakfast foods that I can feed my child that fit those criteria: healthy fats, proteins, and loaded with fiber. So ideas, they're like, okay, well, what am I going to feed him? Like, he only eats cereal. So what about making like a berry crisp, where you're using, lovely berries that are low glycemic. You're going to throw in some really healthy nuts. You can throw in some honey for natural sweetness or maple syrup. You can use coconut flakes and serve that with a little bit of coconut cream on top. I'm willing to bet that most kids will be pretty thrilled because that's kind of a dessert looking thing, right? So they'll be pretty happy to show up to the breakfast table and find they get to eat dessert for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
Another one are little mini egg pizzas. So you use a muffin tin and make eggs. They're like little omelets with sort of pizza type ingredients in them, some natural pepperoni and some tomato sauce and things like that. And those are usually a really big hit, served with a little bit of fruit. So there's lots of ideas out there. And I know at the end we're going to talk about some of the resources that I have for your parents. And when they go and sign up for that, they're going to get the 20 Fabulous Freezer recipes. And I've got a little section in there with, I think, 5 or 6 different breakfast recipes that they could bang out on a weekend, take an hour, and make all of those recipes and then have them in the fridge, in the freezer for the next 2 weeks. And you're setting your child up to help take that one log off of those fires of inflammation. You're helping balance that blood sugar, and you're doing something better for the gut at the same time.
Yeah,
Makes
that's
sense?
great. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And especially that you're, you answered the obvious question already, which is, okay, that sounds good. And how do I do it? So that you're giving us the, those recipes. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
And also the meal planning that, to be able to make 2 weeks worth in advance saves so much time, because that's one of the other hesitations a lot of parents have about doing some of these changes, versus just pouring it out of a cereal or sticking something in the toaster that you bought at the store, that it'll take too much time. So that's really cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. So, okay, so now we're starting to give our kids a healthier breakfast with protein, fat, fiber. Ideally, we find some recipes, some of those are great ideas, the berry crisp and stuff. And they're starting to, accept that a little bit, eat some of that stuff. And
Right.
So then where do we go from there? What's our next step?
So the next thing I would say is take the next week and figure out some of your go-to processed foods that your child uses. So a really great example for this is like the Quaker granola bars or the cereal bars that are ubiquitous in the lunch kits. And think about ways that you could substitute, instead of using those, a more whole food option. So it could be something that you make, and when you're doing your batch cooking for breakfast, you make up a really gut healthy granola bar. And again, I've got some recipes to cover that. Or there are more whole food options as well. If you were to go to a store like Whole Foods or a Planet Organic or something like that, you can find lots of options that are sweetened with dates or honey or maple syrup, and they have more whole foods in them rather than the corn syrup and all the additives and preservatives and things like that in them. So as just your next sort of baby step is to start replacing those processed foods and pick one processed food a week. So one week it might be the granola bars. The next week, maybe it's you eat a lot of pasta. So instead of having pasta 4 times a week, maybe only have pasta once or twice a week and substitute a spaghetti squash or some other kind of vegetable noodle that you make, or you could substitute rice for it, or a rice noodle or something, in that range, so that you are starting to, the idea is that you just slowly over time start to crowd out those processed foods. And for many parents, that is an easier approach than just ripping the Band-Aid off and taking them all out. Now, that wasn't my approach. I'm a like get it done kind of person. And if you're like that, then certainly, go home and clean out your pantry and replace it all with whole food stuff and just jump right in. That's another way to do it. But I know for lots of parents, they need to take those smaller steps. And so once a week, set yourself a goal that this is the food that you're starting to crowd out, and, take those steps. And before you know it, you're going to have a whole lot more nutrient density going on. You're going to be crowding out those foods that feed the bad bacteria. You're going to be feeding the good bacteria. So you're supporting good gut health. You're helping with the blood sugar balance all at the same time.
So then let me ask you, because, you've mentioned now, things that are sweetened with honey or dates or that type of thing.
Yeah.
How different is that, and for our kids than just regular white sugar?
Okay, really good question. Thank you. So the thing with using things like dried fruits and maple syrup and honey, there's yacon syrup is a great one as well. Even stevia leaf powder can be really great. The reason that we prefer to use those when we're talking about functional nutrition is that they actually come with some enzymes and some minerals and some micronutrients of their own that our body can use when it's processing. They also tend to be lower glycemic than just regular sugar does, except for honey. Honey does, but if you balance it with some nuts and some coconut and things like that, it's not as much of a concern. White sugar, processed sugar, corn syrup, all of the things that are in processed food have absolutely zero nutrient value in them, and in fact require the body to use nutrients in order for us to assimilate and process the sugar. So our body actually has to use B vitamins in order for it to deal with the onslaught of processed sugar we're getting. So if you consider how much processed sugar our kids are eating, most of our kids are probably fairly depleted in B vitamins because they're using all that up. So substitute the natural stuff in. It doesn't mean your kid can never have anything sweet, but substitute in the more natural sources and you're getting some nutrition for it. And also, that taste that kids tend to really like.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great too, because again, when we're talking about making some of these changes, depending on where you're starting from, it can be daunting for sure. And so
Yes.
to know that you're not having to rip everything out, and just give your kid, spinach salads or something like that
Right.
that they're never going to eat.
Yes.
That there's options. Yeah. And so you've talked, obviously we've talked about the gut health and the good bugs and the bad bugs and stuff like that. I know you mentioned in our pre-chat a little bit about fermented foods, and I know that's something that you share about frequently. So
Absolutely.
where does that fit into this for our kids?
Yeah, so that's the next step. So getting into introducing our kids to some fermented foods. And I'm not talking Activia yogurt, because that doesn't actually have all that much live culture in it, but something like a kefir would, or a coconut kefir, which is very yogurt-like, and kids will tend to go to. It has, I think, did I read somewhere like 20 billion compared to just, like 1 million or something in the Activia. And we're talking like one strain in the Activia as opposed to like 50 or so different strains in something like kefir. I'm not sure if I'm right exactly on the numbers, but you get the picture. The kefir's got way more diversity. So the idea with eating cultured foods or fermented foods is that they're probiotic rich. So we're actually eating the good bugs that are going to do the good stuff in our guts. So kefir is a great way to get it into our kids. Usually kids will take nicely to fermented pickles. So rather than just buying your pickles in the section of the grocery store on the shelf, you get them in the fridge, and then they've been fermented instead of vinegar pickled. And kids tend to really like those ones. You can also get carrots that are done that way. Sauerkraut. Now, I know most parents will say, well, my kid's not going to eat sauerkraut. But, you can certainly find creative ways to get it into them. So just using the juice from the sauerkraut to make salad dressings. You can use the juice from fermented beets in smoothies, and you don't really even notice it's there. So there's lots of ways to get it into our kids. And I would suggest trying to get about a tablespoon or so of fermented foods into our kids a day, and then sort of working up. So now there's a little caveat with the fermented foods. If your child has severe ADHD or has some other health conditions that go along with it, because we know oftentimes there's comorbidities, right? They might have ADHD, but they also might have some eczema or some asthma or something with it. If they do have eczema or asthma especially, you want to start very slowly with the fermented foods because they may have some histamine issues. And until their bodies are ready to accept that, in other words, we've taken these other steps with the gut and we've replaced the processed foods, sometimes the fermented foods can be a little bit too much. So sometimes we go in and we're like, fermented foods are great for my kid. And, we dump a whole bunch into whatever they're doing. They get a whole smoothie with this much, kefir in it. And then, their symptoms are worse. Well, that's why. So we just need to start slowly and build our way up with the fermented foods. So don't go whole hog, just start little by little and work your way up with your child. And that way you're helping to build that good culture in their guts that's going to drive the cravings for the foods that support their health instead of driving the cravings that cause blood sugar imbalances and other imbalances in the body.
Gotcha. And I notice with my own kids that they kind of develop an affinity for the taste. At first they're kind of like, when you're saying parents are like, oh, my kid will never eat sauerkraut. They, now my kids will drink the juice that's left in the bottom of the jar. And, I think about that because I was never really fed sour tasting foods as a kid. So you kind of like lose your taste for it, but you can also then redevelop it. So I've definitely seen that with other parents too, when they think my kid will never eat this, and then give them a little bit, and then they kind of develop a taste for it.
Absolutely. And that goes into that piece about always presenting foods to our kids. Even if they've rejected it, continue to present it to them. And my son was the same way. He didn't like fermented foods. He didn't even like the pickles at first, but I just kept presenting them to him, and now he loves it. So yeah. Absolutely. They come around.
Yeah. All right. And then I know you mentioned, well, tell us what's next. So you've done all this. You have a solid breakfast. You're changing processed foods, getting the sugars out, replacing those with natural sugars or just less sugar, maybe. Added fermented foods. So you at this point, as a parent, you're likely seeing some change. Would you say typically at this point, or are you still?
Yeah, often, yes. Mm-hmm. With some kids, you can start to see a change just with some of those shifts. So you're increasing their nutrient density, and you're helping that microflora build up, and you're balancing the blood sugar. Sometimes that's enough just by itself. Other kids are going to need a little bit more intervention. And so this is where you might look into starting to take things out of their diet, food intolerances that might be contributing to that inflammation. So that's another log that could be on the fire that you can take off. And so for our kids with ADHD, food additives and food colorings are the first things that should go. And as you're replacing your processed foods with whole foods, you're naturally going to start doing that. You're going to have less of those additives and food coloring. The next thing that we would look at would be some of the more common food intolerances. So my recommendations would be to start cutting back and preferably completely eliminating gluten, corn, soy, and possibly dairy from your child's diet. And I know that most parents now are listening going, what? Like, no, you've told me some stuff and maybe, but now you're talking like crazy talk here because there's no way. But once you've taken those other steps, those first 2 steps, getting down to that step of taking out the gluten and the corn and the soy and possibly dairy is actually not as daunting as it seems when you're just sitting here listening to this right now. And it's also not as daunting when you have all the resources that you need to figure out what in the heck you're going to eat when you're not eating those particular foods. So I know that you have lots of resources for people that are listening, and as well, if they're joining and picking up the free tool that I have for them, it's going to have lots of recipes and ideas for them, because that is where the rubber really hits the road, right? I can talk to you all day about the things that you should be doing, but if you don't have the recipes and ideas to turn that into reality, then nothing's going to happen for your child. So that's what the most important piece is arming parents with those recipes and things that they need.
Right. Yeah. So that's great. You're talking about that. That was actually going to be my next question, because, you shared with me a little bit about what, sort of free resources you wanted to offer our audience, our guests today. And so why don't you tell us a little bit more about that? I know you've sort of mentioned it, but just sort of tell us what if they, what you're offering to these people.
For sure. So one of the things that they can do is I have a private Facebook community called Kids Health Revolution. So if they just go to Facebook and search Kids Health Revolution private group, and they can apply to join. They do have to answer a couple of questions because I want to make sure it's a really safe environment for all my parents that are on there. But I do a weekly live video where it's called the School Snack Series. So I do all kinds of recipes and ideas and things, because school snacks are one place and lunches are one place that a lot of parents struggle. So that's a resource that I want to make sure that all parents know about, that you can come onto that, and then you'll get the actual recipe, the written recipe, right into your inbox each week as well. So you can start compiling those. And sometimes they're a recipe and sometimes they're a product recommendation, something that you can just buy at the store, because I know sometimes convenience foods are what we need, right?
Right.
So then the other thing is I have a community over on my website with 5 resources that I think are really fundamental for any parent who's looking to make these changes. So if they go to kidshealthrevolution.com, and I think you'll probably have a link for it.
Yes, we will. Yeah, below the video.
Yeah,
here.
Perfect. If they go there, they're going to get 5 resources. The most important one probably is that 20 fabulous freezer recipes. So it's got dinner ideas, it's got breakfast ideas, and some snack ideas in there as well. And all of them have instructions for batch cooking if you want to cook a whole bunch at once and have things in your freezer for the week. So that's one. There's a leaky gut quiz there, so it goes into a little bit of the detail as to what leaky gut is and why your kid might have leaky gut. There is my foods cheat sheet. So it's sort of like red light, yellow light, and green light foods. So foods that are absolutely for sure go for it, foods that are like, proceed with caution, and foods that you should definitely, be starting to phase out of your life. And then my natural solutions blueprint. So it's just a little bit of what we've talked about today, but sort of outlined in a visual sort of graphic kind of way for people to kind of follow along with if they need to have that visual. So lots of good stuff, tools that are really helping parents take those actual action steps, because I know from my experience with this that you can get really stuck in analysis paralysis, right? You can listen, you can watch, you can read, you can do all of this stuff until the cows come home. But until you start taking that one first step, you're not actually making a difference for your child. So start taking that one first step, whether it's making a change in your environment, changing your breakfast, whatever it is, but take that one first step.
Awesome. That's very generous of you to offer so much. I mean, that sounds like some really great stuff.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And like you mentioned, we will put the link below this video here so people can find it easily. And then, so you have your Facebook group. I know I've seen you on Instagram. Tell us where else we can, if people want to catch up with, follow what you're up to and stay in touch with you. How do they do that?
Yeah. So there's the Facebook private group. There's also just a Facebook page, Kids Health Revolution. Instagram is Kids Health Rev, and Twitter as well. I'm on Pinterest now and then, but it's better to do Facebook and Instagram. Those are my sort of major hangouts. And those are the places you'll get the live videos as well. So
cool. Yeah. And I've definitely seen, it seems like I've seen a lot where you're teaching us how to make different recipes and things like that, which is, like you just said, analysis paralysis, right? We can have all of the information, but actually getting it into action is where, the difference is made with our kids. So I appreciate that you're out there doing that. I know that's an important and needed thing as well, in addition to all the other stuff. So, well, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate, and I feel like we just got a little snapshot of like this broad topic. And so I really encourage anyone who's been following and watching this today to go check out the resources that Deborah mentioned there, follow the link, and, follow her on social media. And so you can, really dive deeper into this and help our kids really be healthy and, reach their full potential.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Brad, and good luck to all the parents out there.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, connect with us online. You can find us on Facebook at Kids Eating Broccoli Podcast or at Dr. Brad Ellisor DC. You can also go to our website, drellisor.com. That's DOCTORELLISOR.com. Go to iTunes and leave us a review and a rating, or on Stitcher. And be sure to keep in touch with us so you can hear the next episode. Sign up for our mailing list or like us on Facebook. You guys take care now, and let's make the next generation the best generation.